as I've suggested and mentioned to everyone, the 1960s was a period of really robust social revolution in the United States. A lot of the activism during the 1960s centered on various forms of civil rights, rights for minorities, African Americans. There was a Native American rights movement, the women's rights movement, and of course the what we would call today the LGBTQ rights movement, which began usually is considered to have begun in 1969 following a police raid of the Stonewall Inn in New York City. But the 1960s is more than just those types of movements. There are many, many, many other developments going on. So within these greater sort of social rights movement, you had the profound development for the women's rights movement that centered around access to birth control. Now, some scholars have suggested that the 60s was a sexual revolution. Other scholars have said that the 60s wasn't really a sexual revolution. It was really more of a evolution, meaning that in the 1950s, people, um, sexuality did not change for people radically in the 1960s, but in the 1950s, sexuality tended to be more of a closed door thing, not something that was open in society. And so a lot of this was the shift from the private coming into the public. And so the 60s, birth control, the um, a woman's rights over her reproductive um, health was really a huge factor in the women's rights movement during the 1960s. A lot of the 60s, too, involves the usage of drugs. Of course, we'll talk a little bit about the counterculture. A lot of counterculture figures were inspired around the idea that certain types of drugs somehow open the door to a different form of thought about society. And some in the counterculture believed that drug experimentation would somehow open doors that would transform perceptions of citizenship in the United States. One of the most significant individuals in this kind of aspect was Timothy Leary, who was a professor who basically left his field and promoted the use of LSD as a way to transform people's perceptions on the world. There's also a huge issue of poverty in the 1960s. And of course, Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, even though he became associated with the Vietnam War and he really took the ire of anti-war protesters, Johnson's real focus was to solve poverty. He wanted to end poverty. And in respects to like social sort of programs in United States history, next to Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which was kind of like his version of a New Deal, if you will, is really the next most significant era of social and domestic reform. We're talking about programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and other types of programs designed to battle the issue of poverty in the United States. And really, during the 20th century, I think it's fair to say that one of the great and often not widely sung accomplishments of the United States is using the power of federal and state governments to really reduce the level of poverty and the amount of Americans that live in poverty. Environmental activism was a huge factor during the 1960s. And this is another element. So a lot of the activism during the 1960s is not simply centered around these types of items, which are more centered around constitutional rights and people's equal protection for the law. But there's also other issues, as I said, issues like poverty, also like environmentalism as an issue. So today, of course, when we think about environmentalism, we're often thinking about the issue of climate change and the significance that many feel in taking action to address carbon emissions, for example, into the atmosphere. In a lot of ways, the modern environmental movement really started in the 1960s, though you could say the precursor to it goes back to the Gilded Age, with the founding of things like the Sierra Club, for example, and And of course, Theodore Roosevelt being one of the early pioneers of environmental protection and regulated use of the environment. But during the 1960s, America had some major new problems that were now really taking on American cities. So increasingly in the 50s and 60s, Americans are living in the suburbs. The suburbs were these kind of far-flung, spread-out communities in the surrounding areas of urban areas. And during the 50s and 60s, this is sometimes referred to as the white flight, because it was a period of time where relatively affluent or middle-class white people were moving into the suburbs and leaving the sort of urban centers of cities and pursuing the American dream. And of course, that speaks a lot to the sort of racial inequities in the United States, but pursuing the American dream by owning a car or two, having a house in a suburban development, and driving to work every day, and having a TV in your home. Well, with this development, there came all kinds of environmental issues for these areas. First of all, suburban communities were notorious for a number of pollution for groundwater. The types of things that were put on grass, for example, for fertilizer, ultimately became an issue for groundwater. Leaking septic tanks. So your suburban communities at this time, many of them now had septic tanks, which is where the home sewage went. There was a huge issue in the 50s and 60s with leaking septic tanks, leaking into the groundwater. Of course, everyone's driving cars, and at this time, your cars, compared to cars today, very, very poor gas mileage, though, of course, gas was very, very cheap, but very poor gas mileage and very bad emissions. So when you drive a car today, you're driving a car that has pretty incredible emission standards. They have things called catalytic converters and other systems designed to clean up the stuff coming out of the tailpipe. Well, your cars in the 50s and 60s did not have that. And if you've ever been around a car that doesn't have a catalytic converter, you'll immediately notice the significant odor of the exhaust. So as a result of this, so many people driving cars, there were at this point, there was as many cars, if not more, than there was the population of the country. And all of the commuting, all of the driving of cars created a huge problem in some large areas like Los Angeles, where we start to see the development of what's called photochemical smog, this haze over the city. There's also problems with chemical pollution, issues. If you see down here, health and safety advances. Rachel Carson authored the book The Silent Spring, which was about the overwhelming pollution from the pesticide DDT, which was negatively affecting bird populations, but was also very bad for human health. There were other significant activists for consumers. This is consumer protection here, like Ralph Nader, who, of course, ran for the presidency in the early 2000s, particularly in the election of George W. Bush versus Al Gore. Ralph Nader in 2000 ran as a third-party candidate under the Green Party. But he wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, in which he criticized the Chevy Corvair, which had a tendency to roll over. And this book really started to become a central factor in leading the way for safety in the automobile industry. And of course, remember at this time, many cars don't have seat belts. If they do, it's only a lap belt. So cars are not as safe. And this helped to encourage the development of safety advances in automobiles. So the 60s, we're talking about a widespread array of social activism. It's a social revolution. Some of this activism is centered around the variant forms of civil rights, which could be, of course, we're talking about the pursuit of equal rights for people, equal protections for people before the Constitution, a right to equal employment, a right to equal pay, a right to vote, these types of things, as we talked about with the civil rights movement previously in this class. So these could be Native American rights. There is the Chicano movement, which is a Latin American rights movement. Of course, the African American civil rights movement, women's rights, gay rights, all part of this in the 1960s. And of course, for women, as I mentioned, very much centered around the development of the advent of the birth control pill factored into this, um, as well as eventually the activism by individuals like Gloria Steinem, um, who was a famous activist for women at this time period, who promoted the need for a right to reproductive rights in terms of a right to choose whether or not an individual wanted to terminate a pregnancy. Um, the 60s is a reaction to really the post-World War II generation. And we're talking about post-World War II generation, we're talking about an era in which communities are segregated, residentially segregated along racial lines or ethnic lines. The workplace is inherently discriminatory. If you were a woman and you worked in a job, which there was a lot of avenues that were closed to women and other minorities, but you would be paid less just because of your gender. And of course, this will lead to the development of the Equal Pay Act. But as we know, just because a law is passed, it doesn't mean that it solves all the problems. So women to this day are still really struggling to really realize true equal pay and equality in general in the workplace. The 1950s, too, was a society centered around a male-dominated nuclear family in which you had two or three kids, a mother and a father. The mother took care of the kids, stayed at home. The father went out and worked in the public sphere. And this was a reality that really, for women, was particularly repressive for their own economic and individual independence. And a lot of the women's rights movement was very much a reaction to that male-dominated society. And again, technology, televisions, widespread energy production, the use of chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, the petrochemical boom in the automobile industry are all sort of driving issues surrounding environmental activism and so forth. And so the 1960s is really a revolution in a lot of ways, though again, in certain respects, you would say it's an evolution, and it's really bringing some of these issues to the fore, as opposed to sort of bringing them out of sort of nowhere. But it's a real transformation in how society is thinking about issues surrounding family, surrounding gender, race, and sexuality, and so forth. One of the umbrellas of this period of time, when you think about activism in the 1960s, they say an umbrella. A lot of the activism during the 1960s really centered around the anti-war movement, the movement against the war in Vietnam. The anti-war movement, in a lot of respects in the late 60s, became a sort of umbrella under which there were many, many, many variant groups that were not only pushing for an end to the Vietnam War, but were also pushing for other changes in society. A primary goal of many protesters during this period of time was what they saw as a more equal, egalitarian, a more equal and democratic society. And so there were groups like the SDS, for example, that was named the Students for a Democratic Society. Many anti-war protesters saw American society as fundamentally unequal and, as a result, not truly democratic. And they saw the government's motivations in things like the Vietnam War as to be motivations that did not truly represent the will of the people, but rather represented the will of individuals within the military-industrial complex. If you think for a second, what's the myth of the anti-war protester? And it looks like I spelled that wrong, but there should be an ER, I believe. But the myth of the anti-war protester, I think, as you look at a picture like this, the myth is that it was really just a bunch of college students. They were just college kids out there having fun. In reality, it wasn't simply a bunch of college kids. That's actually a myth. In truth, they weren't violent very often at all. Most protests are peaceful. They weren't simply a bunch of college kids out there having fun. They weren't necessarily un-American. In many cases, the anti-war protesters are truly American in their behavior and seeking to improve American society. Now, not always the case. Of course, there were individuals out in any kind of thing like this that were causing problems. There were cases of violence, but there was cases of violence perpetrated by protesters and by authority figures alike. So these are kind of myths that a lot of Americans think about the anti-war movement, that they're a bunch of college kids out there trying to have a good time, that they're often violent, or that they're un-American. And these are actually largely inaccuracies about this movement. And we'll talk about some of the specifics about who were anti-war protesters in a minute. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about higher education. Why talk about higher education? Well, even though the protest movement was not exclusively a college thing, it wasn't simply a bunch of college kids, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But the reality was that increased enrollment in college and increased educational opportunity was a significant part of why the anti-war movement occurred. From 1950 to 1960, college enrollment increased from 2 million to 7 million people. So it more than tripled in a period of 10 years. Now, why? And of course, most of the colleges, like our college, that you're a part of, is itself representative of this expansion in higher education and the opportunity for higher education in the United States. A big reason why this was happening is because the federal and state governments started supporting higher education in a more robust fashion. Why do they do that? Well, a big reason why the federal and state government does this, there's kind of two big reasons. The first one is the Cold War. Whether you were a Republican or you were a Democrat, generally speaking, the mainstreams of the parties all agreed in one thing when it came to foreign policy, and that was that the United States really needed to contain communism. And of course, after 1949, 1950, when you see the Soviet Union in 1949 detonate an atomic bomb, you see China fall to the communist forces of Mao Zedong, you see the Korean War in 1950, and then, of course, the escalating hostilities in Vietnam, increasingly figures in the mainstream of the American federal government believed that we needed to wage a Cold War and contain communism throughout the globe. That meant building the best military equipment. That meant building the best computer technology, building the best missile systems. It meant building the best planes. Because the United States truly believed that its advantage against the forces of communism in the world really centered around its ability to maintain an advantage in terms of science and technology. There's lots and lots of federal and state government support into higher education for that purpose. A lot of individuals also understood it's essential to economic growth. We know today it is a fact that those who obtain college degrees make more money than those who don't. It doesn't mean you can't be successful without a college degree, and there are many people at this time and today that are successful without a college degree. But on the average, if you get a college degree, you make more money. And that, of course, means more people spending into the economy and more economic growth. So there's this thinking, too. You educate your populace, it helps you out in important areas like the Cold War. It helps you to develop a more robust economy. And many liberal Democrats as well took it to the next level and said, higher education should be something that everyone deserves as a birthright. That many liberal Democrats believed that a healthy democracy meant you had the most educated populace you could have, so they could make the best decisions for society. So there were many liberal Democrats as well who advocated this robust funding for higher education as something that, like in the New Deal, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he presented his so-called Economic Bill of Rights, saying that everyone should have a right to a quality education. And certainly many liberal Democrats picked up on that idea from FDR. So education matters here in terms of the anti-war movement. College matters in terms of the anti-war movement, even though it's not just a bunch of college kids protesting, but the reality is colleges function as a part of the community. It's a place where meetings are held. It's a place where gatherings are held. It's a place where speakers come. It's a place where events happen. It's a place where information occurs and in thinking and conversations occur. And as a result of that, the college campus was many times at the kind of center of discussions over the war in Vietnam. So again, who protested now? Here you see a kind of picture of protesters in the United States, and it kind of gives you a sense of the diverse nature of protests. And of course, this photo you see is the photo of a person wounded by napalm, which was one of the napalm was a weapon in Vietnam. It's jellied gasoline, and it maimed and it caused a great deal of harm to civilians who were sometimes accidentally affected by napalm when airstrikes missed their target or when guerrillas were attacked in areas that were close to population zones. But who protested? It was a wide array of individuals. And the individuals that protest, it's important to note, in terms of people out in the street protesting, it's never a large chunk of society, maybe 20 to 25%. It's a present and vocal group of people, but it is a minority. Now, the Vietnam War, by 1967 and 1968, is increasingly unpopular. And Lyndon Johnson's handling of it is even more unpopular. But that doesn't mean that those people were out in the street protesting. So the anti-war movement makes up maybe about 20 to 25% of American society at its height. It's not a homogenous group, meaning it's not just one group of people. It's not just a bunch of college kids. It's a wide array. Some of them are college kids and involve groups like the SDS, which was a sort of a social democratic movement. So they would have advocated something more in the way of like a reform socialist system. And they were called Students for a Democratic Society. And they promoted and advocated around college campuses. Professors, a lot of times, were at the heart of the anti-war movement. They held talks about the issues in Vietnam. They worked with students who were part of clubs and organizations. And in that sense, professors oftentimes played a role in the anti-war movement. There were many mothers who protested, of course, the idea, some of them, excuse me, of young people being drafted to go fight in Vietnam. Civil rights leaders, of course, the most noteworthy civil rights leaders to oppose the war in Vietnam outwardly, openly, and passionately would be Stokely Carmichael and, of course, Martin Luther King, who in 1967 gave one of his most famous speeches in which he indicted the Vietnam War as the United States basically unjustly unleashing destruction on another part of the world and not doing really anything to improve the conditions of its own people. So civil rights leaders oftentimes came out in outward displays against the war. There were women's movement leaders who were prominent in the protest movement as well. Artists like Joan Baez, for example, the famous folk singer who was often predominant in areas like San Francisco. Even veterans. There was an entire movement of veterans that protested the Vietnam War. The most predominant group was the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, called the VVAW. And it's one of its primary figures leading it was actually the future Secretary of State and presidential candidate John Kerry, who of course had served in Vietnam. He was a swift boat captain, and these were boats that fought on the rivers of the Mekong Delta. And he actually earned 2 Purple Hearts, meaning that he had been wounded in action on 2 separate occasions. And John Kerry came back to the United States and became a outspoken activist against the war. And the VVAW, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, actually staged some of the most memorable protests. The Winter Soldier protest in, I believe it was 1970, was in Washington, D.C., and veterans blocked parts of the roadways going into the cities. So that was a very significant part, too. Of course, musicians, artists, pop culture figures were a big part of this. Of course, famously, the Woodstock Festival in 1969 was one of the most outward sort of music events that certainly not only embodied the counterculture, but very much symbolized much of the anti-war movement as well. There were socialists within the anti-war movement. There were church figures within the anti-war movement, clergy members. There were hippie counterculture figures as well. So it was a really, really, really wide array of individuals that were part of the anti-war movement. And oftentimes their goals were not exactly identical. Pictured here, you see in this picture, this is Dean Rusk. Dean Rusk was the U.S. Secretary of State during the administration of John F. Kennedy, and of course also during Lyndon Johnson's administration. And of course, the United States Americanized the war under Lyndon Johnson's presidency in 1965, meaning the United States directly took over fighting in Vietnam. Rusk was always an avid proponent of the war policy, and he lived his life after the war insisting that it was really the media that had undermined U.S. public support for the war. And it's important to note that the United States, of course, did not win the Vietnam War. The United States lost the Vietnam War, but it didn't lose the Vietnam War necessarily because it had not performed, its military had not performed exceptionally, but rather the United States, after several years, particularly after 1968, the United States basically, as a country, lost a will to continue the war. Americans did not support the purpose of the war. The war became incredibly costly in terms of economics, but most importantly in terms of American lives. There's some 60,000 Americans that were killed in this war. And to give us some perspective, that number dwarfs the death toll of the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, which are far lower numbers. So it was an incredibly destructive conflict. And after 1968, Americans really began to, as a country, demand that their government take a different direction. And that led in the Nixon administration to basically a slow withdrawal of the United States from Vietnam, which occurred officially in 1973. And of course, the government in Saigon, without robust American support, collapsed in 1975 to the forces of North Vietnam, the communist forces. And Saigon would become Ho Chi Minh City. The free speech movement at the University of California, Berkeley is really considered the beginning of the anti-war movement, even though it wasn't as much about the anti-war movement at that time as it was about promoting free speech on campus, because there was an issue on the campus. This is California, Berkeley, so this is in the greater San Francisco Bay Area. And there was this issue where you had student groups like CORE that couldn't politically mobilize, but you had corporations like DuPont and Dow Chemical that were holding job fairs, and that was fine. And it was fine in the administration standpoint at the college, and it led to a major protest movement where there were sit-ins. A sit-in is where you go into a building, you occupy it, and you effectively refuse to leave unless there are compromises done. So there were campus buildings that were occupied, and this is really kind of where a lot of the momentum for the anti-war movement really begins to emerge in 1964 in California at the free speech movement, UC Berkeley. When you think about the anti-war movement, it's not as though Americans started fighting in Vietnam and then immediately people went out there and started protesting. In fact, it was kind of a gradual development, just like the American war in Vietnam was gradual. The United States started with a smaller number of troops. It started with advisors, of course, and then by 65, you're bombing in Vietnam. You have a smaller number of direct combat troops in Vietnam, and of course, the United States gradually increased its numbers in Vietnam. constantly looking to find the breaking point of the enemy. There wasn't a real clear strategy for success in Vietnam. And in a lot of ways, the anti-war movement kind of resembled that on the home front. It started out in 1965, right alongside the first phases of the American sort of direct fighting in Vietnam. And it started in the form of teach-ins. And what a teach-in is, and this is why colleges and universities kind of mattered so much. A teach-in, and the first was held at the University of Michigan, and about 3,000 attended. And what a teach-in was designed to be was professors and students, and they would invite intellectuals, even from the United States State Department, to come and participate. And they would all meet in the big gathering hall at the university in this big event. And there would be a panelists, and people would ask questions, and students would make statements, and other people would make statements from both sides. And it was really it's an amazing kind of, this is why universities and colleges are really an exciting place to be, because you can find these types of engaging events that ask you to really think about important subjects at hand in the country. And in 1965, it was Vietnam, and the beginnings of Vietnam. So they started to have these teach-ins. Teach-ins where the idea was you would get there and let's educate ourselves about Vietnam. The reality is, though, it doesn't really take the shape that many people wanted it to take. The State Department, and again, this is Dean Rusk here, the Secretary of State, some of his underlings in the State Department did attend and attempted to participate, but they really came off as dismissive and arrogant. They kind of looked at the people doing this and said, you don't understand what this is about, and you really should just leave this up to the smart people who know what they're doing and who are specialists on this. And so for students who were thinking critically or criticizing even the Vietnam War at this time, that was it was come off as dismissive and disappointing for many. When the war in Vietnam really starts to develop, when it really starts to escalate, I should say, and you start to see more and more combat deaths, and you start to see more and more images and news footage of fighting and intense action in the Vietnam War, the biggest issues that emerged for protesters were the draft and the usage of chemical type weapons. And this is not like gas weapons. These are weapons like napalm. Napalm, again, from the protest image I showed you in the last slide. So napalm is jellied gasoline. And so when you see a footage of a plane making an airstrike during Vietnam, there's some of the bombs that you see that kind of tumble, and those are the napalm bombs. And so a napalm bomb, what happens is it explodes, and the gasoline, the jellied gasoline, all lights on fire. And then it's a huge ball of fire, and it sticks to anything that it touches, and it burns very hot. And so when you had napalm, which was used widely in Vietnam, you had napalm strikes that maybe missed their target and hit close to a village or a rice paddy, or maybe because it's a guerrilla war, which is hard to differentiate, as we know, from combatant and civilian, maybe the targets are accidentally hit. But you have some terrible, terrible incidents where civilians are maimed by napalm. Agent Orange, of course, was the defoliant. It's a highly carcinogenic chemical agent that was used to kill the leaves on the trees in Vietnam. And the idea was, if you killed all the leaves on the trees, then that would expose the guerrillas and make it more feasible to fight these individuals, who, of course, were staging ambushes and setting booby traps, and very difficult to locate. Agent Orange, of course, was a carcinogen, and after the war, it caused a great deal of suffering for many veterans, who many of which were never properly compensated for their being exposed to this highly carcinogenic chemical agent. Probably more than any, the draft was a huge issue for anti-war protesters. So unlike the war in Iraq and Afghanistan of the 21st century, the entire army in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan were volunteers. They were professionally trained soldiers who joined the military for one reason or another, or signed up to go fight in Iraq or Afghanistan. during Vietnam, you had that, but you also had a percentage of the soldiers, maybe 20 to 25%, maybe a little bit more or less, who were drafted. And that means that, when you sign up for selective service when you become 18, you sign up for selective service, and that means if it's ever needed that they need to, fight to defend the country, you could be asked to fight whether you've signed up for the military voluntarily or not. And the draft was during the 60s, it was a very, very unequal issue, because if you were in college, you were exempt from the draft. And of course, if you were wealthy, there were ways to get around it as well. So the draft tended to sort of select those individuals who were working class in the United States, poor individuals and working class individuals. And as a result of that, for example, the African American community, who had suffered tremendously from racial discrimination and inequality in the United States, as a result of that longevity of racial inequality in the United States, African Americans were their communities had greater numbers of poverty and less numbers of them that were enrolled in college. And as a result of that, they were drafted more frequently to fight in the war in Vietnam. And so African Americans made up only 13% of the American society, but yet something in the way of nearly 30% of them were fighting in the front lines, if you will, of the Vietnam War. So the draft was economically and racially unequal, kind of resembling the inequalities of the United States as a whole. The big sort of increases in the anti-war movement occurs in late '66. We saw a 30,000 person protest in Washington, D.C., which was organized by the Students for a Democratic Society. And this was in response to Lyndon Johnson's increasing troops to nearly 400,000 by the next year in 1967. The biggest, probably most remembered of the protest events was the October 1967 Stop the Draft Week protest, which again, in line with what I just mentioned about the controversy surrounding the draft, this protest was organized in October 1967 to basically demand that people stop being, drafted, forced to fight in Vietnam. And here you see this individual here burning his draft card. So people used to receive draft cards, and if your name was called, your number was called, you went and responded, and you had your draft number on the card. And so they would have these protests, and they would send hats around, and everybody would put their draft card in the hat, and then would burn the hat. This individual, of course, is burning it in his hand as a symbol for a picture. Here you see in Washington, D.C., the military police units out here just directly in front of this group of protesters. And this was an incredibly intensive protest. During this protest, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who was already planning to step aside, he actually had a case where in front of the Pentagon, an individual, clearly not in his right state mentally, an individual actually burned himself to death in front of the Pentagon in protest to the war. And of course, we know that a number of Buddhist monks had burned themselves to death in protest to the U.S.-supported government in 1963 in Vietnam as well. You had 100,000 people in Washington, D.C. in this protest, chanting things like, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh is going to win, or hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? These were all, that's LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. Johnson's handling of the war, the president, was down 28%. And the populace as a whole generally agreed or generally opposed the war at this time. So you're looking at now a lower and lower amount of the populace that actually is in support of the U.S. war effort, and even less of the American populace that supports Lyndon Johnson's handling of the war effort. And we're almost there. We're almost done. 2 more slides. As protests escalated in 1965 and 67, Lyndon Johnson, president right here, you see him pictured right here, he was very angry. And his view, and now Johnson is a controversial figure. Here is an individual who he didn't want to be a war president. He didn't want to be a president that was remembered for going to war. He wanted to be a president that would be remembered as like the next Franklin Roosevelt. He wanted to be a president that would be remembered for ending poverty. That was his goal. He wants to do social programs and he wants to end poverty. But he was advised, and he took over from Kennedy, and then he won the election in his own right in 1964. He was advised by members of his National Security Council that Vietnam was important to contain communism. And his personality was such that once he made a decision on something, he would stick to the decision. And if you started criticizing his policy, he'd see you as disloyal, and he would kind of cut you out of the circle, if you will. And so he was kind of undermined by his own personality trait here. Though, again, he's a controversial figure, and he made a lot of very, very important, or he helped to establish some of the very, very important legacies in American society. Medicare, healthcare for elderly people, Medicaid, that's Johnson. So he championed a number of very important programs. He also, of course, signed the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65 as well. But ultimately, Johnson's presidency will really be destroyed by the Vietnam War. He saw all the protesters as communists, which, of course, we already know it's not true, but he saw the protesters as communists. He was incredibly angry when individuals who had worked with him spoke out against the war. Martin Luther King, for example, who Johnson spoke with and met with regularly, and of course they together worked. Of course, we know civil rights really occurred at the grassroots level first, but they really worked to develop civil rights legislation. But in 1967, when Martin Luther King comes out in opposition to the war in Vietnam, Johnson was infuriated, and he had the FBI, led at the time by J. Edgar Hoover, infiltrate anti-war groups, infiltrate civil rights groups. They kept files and tabs on Martin Luther King because now they were seeing him as some kind of a subversive and anti-government figure. There were illegal wiretaps where they were listening in on people's phone conversations. There were figures in the anti-war movement that were harassed by the IRS. They might audit you, make life difficult for you. They kept files on people. This was the FBI program known as COINTELPRO, and it was basically a domestic surveillance program of the American people. And it's these types of policies, first with Johnson, and then, of course, Richard Nixon takes these types of programs to another level. And, of course, we know Nixon was very corrupt in other ways, too, organizing break-ins of his political opponents, organizing break-ins of figures that leaked information to the press, like Daniel Ellsberg. And so, but this kind of, these types of actions, first with Johnson and then even more so with Nixon, really start a path for the American people where a lot of Americans start to lose a little bit of faith in their government. And I think most historians would agree that the Vietnam War really left the perception of the office of president and the government itself somewhat damaged, maybe irrevocably, by some of this controversy during Vietnam. Because this all came out in leaked information, particularly the Pentagon Papers in the 1970s, and then, of course, during the various proceedings surrounding Nixon's impeachment, or, well, the proceeds leading to what would have been his impeachment and the Watergate scandal. Last slide. So another big element of the anti-war movement, and also a general, like, sort of attempt at a cultural revolution in the 1960s, was, of course, the counterculture. And this here is a picture of individuals associated with the counterculture, loaded on top of of this bus that would have been known as the Further Bus, and it was associated with bands like the Grateful Dead and individuals like Ken Kesey, who organized a group known as the Merry Pranksters, and they were they were out of California, and they would travel across the country and do kind of weird, um, sort of like sometimes they did things like street play performances and these types of things, but their whole thing was to like challenge normality. They wanted to shock people. They wanted their behavior and their attitudes to shock people and drive them to question what was constructed as normal. A lot of times that's centered on music. So this is the 60s. And so in the 60s, you're talking about really, in terms of the way music traditionally was, pretty radical sounding music, right? With some of the first psychedelic albums, the Beatles, for example, with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, early Pink Floyd, The Grateful Dead. These were psychedelic bands that very much embraced the sort of um, this counterculture in music and using music as almost in some cases a revolutionary vehicle. Woodstock kind of represented that as a festival in 1969. They're hoping to challenge the norms of society, and they want to reconstruct sort of their vision. I think you would say would be reconstruct um, uh, citizenship and how Americans think about what is normal. So they often challenge gender norms, they challenge behavioral norms, they challenge the norms of sexuality. Many oftentimes they use drugs, particularly psychedelic drugs. The idea here was to like open up new avenues for critical thought and so forth, and somehow redefine citizenship. Many of them too were kind of attacking the capitalist economic system. For example, a precursor to the group known as the hippies was known as the diggers, and the diggers were basically communalistic. They thought capitalism was a fundamentally unjust system, and as a result of that, they sought to oppose it. Now, of course, we know the counterculture ultimately is not that way. In fact, the counterculture is quite capitalistic as a whole as it develops. If you look at a band like the Grateful Dead, I don't know if anybody's heard of that band before, but the Grateful Dead became one of the most successful touring acts of all time, and they created a tremendous amount of sort of clothing, stickers, all kinds of things that were sold. Their concerts would have been a very much an alternative capitalist consumerist event. So the overwhelming majority of them were not into this, but some sought to cast off capitalism and pursue a form of communalism. Those types of experiments often failed, and largely the counterculture, would not have, in many areas, probably you would say they did not like sort of what they thought they were hoping to.